Hello, this is Dr. Churchill again for Into the Final Frontier, Astronomy 308. Welcome back. And today's lecture is going to be on the Soviet version of the space race in the early 1960s. Today we are going to cover basically from Yuri Gagarin's flight up all the way to the death of Sergei Korolov, and then end with a little bit of discussion of what's coming after that. So as you know, we have gone through the launching of Sputnik, which is really the moment that started the space race and panicked the United States, got them engaged in the space race quite seriously now with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union at this time is being run by Premier Khrushchev. And Khrushchev was really a tough cookie and one who was very interested in getting his way and also in, I would say, publicity stunts, everything that he could think of in order to get the attention of the world focused on the Soviet Union in a positive way as part of this Cold War, charade aspect of what the Kremlin was doing, what Khrushchev was doing. And at this point, what I want to have us talk about is how we got this, how the Soviets were able to develop the space race and leapfrog in front of the United States and do a little bit of comparison toward the end. So I'm going to bring up the lecture slides. Okay, here we go. So today is the part one, if you will, of the Soviet space race. And we're going to first talk about a few of the main players here, just to introduce you to some of the individuals who are driving this forward. And these individuals become prominent again when we talk about this part two of the Soviet space race, which is really their lunar program, which they had three, and all three failed, as we'll see. Okay, so in the center image here is the amateur rocket group that started in the Soviet Union, and that our chief designer of the Soviet rockets, Sergei Korolov, was a member of that group. And then you'll remember during World War II that he went and to Peenemünde in Germany to find rocket scientists and bring them back. And from there, he really became one of the highest ranking people in charge of the rocket program in the Soviet Union. Along with him, Korolov here pictured, was Valentin Glushko. And Glushko, if you remember right, was the person who was the engine builder. So that's what his wheelhouse was. And you might remember also that during the purges of Stalin before World War II, Glushko had fingered Korolov, and so Korolov then ended up going to a forced labor camp for on the order of 10 years, where he lost a lot of his teeth, and he became very unhealthy, so to speak, so that his later health and life was never robust and strong, and it probably led to his early demise in 1966, which really was the turnaround point between the United States and the Soviet Union, as far as the momentum and the impetus and the brain power that the Soviet Union had were really almost strictly due to Korolov. Here's a beautiful image of him here, and this here is a picture of the operating table, which I think is referring to his botched death, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but he basically died from a botched operation. This is the image of Sputnik, the perpetrator of the space race. You can see how large it is, weighed about 180 pounds and had a radio transmitter in it, and circled the Earth about every 90 minutes, and really what caused the space race to start. So let's move on now to what the lift vehicles were between the Soviets and the United States. So we mentioned earlier that the Soviet workhorse was the R-7 rocket that was developed by Korolov, and it was on the R-7 that all the Sputnik satellites had been lifted off. It was capable of carrying about a 5-ton hydrogen bomb, 7,000 miles. So, this was the rocket that was designed to fire nukes on the United States. But Korolov realized that he could use it to, move his dreams of human spaceflight forward and the idea of moving humans out into the universe. So this is an image over here of our schematic, the R-7 Soviet rocket. And if you remember our Project Mercury lecture, Project Mercury used 2 different boosters. For the first 2 flights of Shepard and Grissom, they were suborbital flights, and those were flown on the Redstone booster, which is an Army ICBM. So this is called the Mercury Redstone being mated up here. Those were the first 2 flights. Then from John Glenn forward, all the orbital flights use the Atlas lifter booster from the Navy. And so this is called the Mercury Atlas mating. Then when we had Project Gemini, the Project Gemini capsule sat on top of a Titan II booster. And the Titan II was also another nuclear bomb lifting ICBM. So you get a feeling for the difference in these rockets. And I think you can also tell just by looking at them, which one had the greatest lifting power by quite a large margin. And that was the R-7. So it really was the most powerful rocket that anybody had built during the early 1960s. We're going to be talking mostly about the manned programs. There's a great deal that Korolov did. He sent probes to Venus. He sent probes around the moon. He photographed the backside of the moon, so that many of the features on the far side of the moon have Russian names. He put up some of the first communication satellites, and this gentleman really did it all, including put the first human into space. His first program that he put together was called Vostok, and that ran from 1961 until 1963. Their second program was called Voskhod, and that was supposed to have about 6 or 7 flights in it, but it turned out that it only had 2 flights. And there were kind of 2 reasons. One was that Korolov himself died in 1966, and so after the second flight, they canceled the remainder flights and moved into something they called the Soyuz program. The other thing is that Khrushchev was disposed as the premier of the Soviet Union. And so you had a new premier come in, and during that turmoil, that the Voskhod program got canceled. So here's the Vostok program. And here are the Soviet cosmonauts that flew in these missions. I'm just going to review them very quickly. This is a little table that I clipped off of Wikipedia. The first flight, of course, they're numbered 1 through 6. Vostok 1, April 12th, 1961. Now, this is a very famous date if you are a fan of human spaceflight. April 12, 1961, the first day a human being orbited the Earth and went into space. And that human being is Yuri Gagarin. And the April 12th now is celebrated every year as Gagarin Day. Or actually, pardon me, it's called Yuri's Day. So he did 1 orbit, and we'll talk about his flight in just a few minutes. This is a picture of Yuri Gagarin in the lower left. And again, first man in space did 1 orbit. And you'll see here then in August of 61, German Titov was the second Soviet to go into space. And it turned out that he flew, I believe, between Shepard's flight and Gus Grissom's flight. So you had basically Yuri Gagarin, and then I think you had Shepard, and then you had German Titov, and then you had Gus Grissom. And I might have the Titov Grissom out of order, but if they were out of order, it was only by a bit. So anyway, the thing that's different is while the United States was doing suborbital flights, which is not even putting a human in orbit, German Titov orbited the Earth 17 times. And this really blew the United States away. It's one thing to put a person in orbit, one orbit, but 17 orbits. That's a considerable amount of time. And in fact, the duration of his flight was, longer than a day, a little over a day. And this really marked a tremendous leap compared to what the United States was doing. So you can see right away that the Soviet Union is engaging in missions that are designed to really impress the world and make the United States feel insecure, which they were successful at doing. Now, the next big step, and we learned that we didn't do this until Project Gemini, was to rendezvous two spacecraft in orbit. And the thing about that was, if you remember, was that required the ability to maneuver from one orbit to another, to change orbits. That means actually flying the spacecraft. And at this point in time, people just went up in orbit and with no power, just went around the Earth and then did a powered retrofire to descend back into the atmosphere. The Soviets didn't know how to do any orbit changing either. But Khrushchev wanted to fool the United States that they had developed the ability to put two craft up in orbit at the same time and then make it look like they actually had rendezvous. And for all we would know, perhaps dock. They could have lied about it. And the reason is because in those days you did not have surveillance satellites. There was no way to verify what was going on in space and Earth orbit. And so anything that they had said they could have done. So what we have is Vostok 3 and Vostok 4 taking off a day apart from each other in August of 1962, a year after Titov's flight. So these were two spacecraft that were up at the same time, but they had no ability to rendezvous because they had no ability to change orbit or control their orbits, what orbit they were in. So this is the first time that you have simultaneous flights. So that was another first for the Soviet Union. And this is Andrei Nikolaev and Pavel Popovich that flew these two missions. But they never did actually get within more than, I think, 5 miles of each other or something like that. Is the closest I think the two craft drifted from each other. Nikolaev on Vostok 3 did 64 orbits and Popovich did 48 orbits. So you can see, again, the number of orbits is a tremendous number. And all through this period of time, the Mercury astronauts were doing 3 orbits, and stuff like that. I can't remember what Gordon Cooper did, but it was like 36 orbits or something like that. Finally, at the very end, because they were pushed, NASA was pushed to do a large number of orbits in order to show that they were in the game with the Soviet Union. Then in June of 1963, they pulled it off again by doing 2 spacecraft in space at the same time. So first of all was Voskhod in 1963, did a 4-day, 23-hour mission, almost 5 days. So up to that point in time, this gentleman here, second from the right on the bottom, had done the longest mission of any human being, the duration record, and he did 82 orbits. While he was up, 2 days later, they put up Vostok 6. And this again was a Khrushchev idea in order to make sure that the Soviets had another first, and that was what they put the first woman in space. So here we have Valentina Tereshkova, who flew on Vostok 6, and she was the first woman to orbit the Earth, be in space, and she did 48 orbits before she came back down. So this is my single slide, just sort of outlining the first human in space, again, on Yuri's Day, April 12th. This was in 1961. And I'm just showing some little images here. Here's the image of the R-7 rocket lifting off. Here's a picture of Yuri Gagarin, either in a simulation flight or getting ready for his flight. I'm not sure which it is. Now, interestingly, a little known fact is that the astronauts all developed little rituals. The American astronauts developed their rituals and the Soviets developed their rituals. One of the things that you will always see every American, at every liftoff from the United States of the American space program, is when the clock starts on the spacecraft in the capsule, they will say, and the clock has started. And that's because Alan Shepard, the first American to fly into space, that was the first thing he said at liftoff. He said, and the clock has started. And so now you'll hear that on every mission from the United States. One of the things that Yuri Gagarin did was that for good luck, he decided to pee on the tire of the bus that brought him out to this launch pad. And so it has become a ritual of the astronauts for good luck to pee on the tire of the space bus when they leave. Just thought you'd enjoy that bit of trivia. Here's an image of the spacecraft, the Vostok 1 spacecraft, and you can see it's very different than if you, the Max Faget design of the blunt-end capsule. The design that Korolov and his engineers came up with was the spherical spacecraft, and the idea there was that you still had sort of a blunt side. No matter how it rotated, you always had a blunt side getting the heat side of the reentry. So even if the spacecraft rotated and was unstable, then you would always have this blunt area that could dissipate the heat. The thing about a capsule with the United States was that you had to have it stabilized so that the blunt end was stable as it was racing through the atmosphere. A lot more difficult engineering design and mission thresholds to achieve. And you can see here on the R7 rocket, I'm showing it on the upper left corner of this image, where the Vostok 1 fit in the rocket itself. And you can see the spacecraft itself is round, and this area here is the service module. Again, the service module contains the oxygen, the fuel cells, the batteries, all of the things that help generate electricity, life support, and things like that. And sometimes even the fuel and some of the retro rockets or the directional reaction control system rockets. So the thing is that then before re-entry, that this green module here, the service module, is jettisoned from the orbiting spacecraft itself. Now, one of the things that happened with the Soviets is they really had trouble with this jettisoning of the service module. And a lot of times it would get stuck. And when they were re-entering, it would be trailing behind them until the straps or whatever was holding it to the spacecraft burned up and it would fall away. And this turned out to be fatal for one of the cosmonauts later, and we'll talk about him in a bit. The orbital track is given here in this map of the Earth with the red line for the orbit. And you can see that liftoff happened here in Baikonur, which was their basically their launch site and for their space program. And then coming around, he came underneath South America, back up through Africa, and then landed back in the Soviet Union. So the Soviets did not want their spacecraft to be in international waters or in international areas at all. So they were very secretive. So they decided to learn how to land on land and to do it back near the launch site. So here's the profile of Yuri's flight. You fly up, and then on the R7, you can see all of these side rockets that are strap-on or belt-ons, and so they burn up, they jettison. The central core still takes you up into orbit, and then you're using, if you remember right, the multi-staging of rockets that was invented by Herman Oberth, and then you can see that finally you're set in orbit in the spacecraft with the surface module. You do your orbit, and then you jettison the service module, and then you're re-entering as the sphere. And then at a certain height, which I think was around 10,000 feet, the way this was designed was that Yuri was then jettisoned out of the spacecraft and came down on his own with a parachute, and then the spacecraft came down on its own on the parachute. And so here's a picture of the ejection chair from which Yuri was ejected, and here's the spacecraft, the Voskhod 1, after it had landed. This was an amazing engineering feat. As you can see, it's very crude by today's standards, but a very exceptional engineering feat. And here is basically a random newspaper from the United States: man enters space, Soviet officer orbits globe in 5-ton ship. So this really shook the world. This happened, like I said, in April of 1961. Now, interestingly, I didn't talk about this, but Alan Shepard was supposed to fly in early April. And if Alan Shepard had flown in early April, he would have beat Gagarin, and Alan Shepard would have been the first human being in space, not just the first American, but the first human being and the first American. But what happened was the flight, which was the test flight before his, there was a malfunction. And the chimpanzee that had been in that flight, it didn't get injured, he just really got pissed off. But the technical difficulties that happened in that flight that caused the rocket to go much higher than it was supposed to go, and some electric shocks that kept shocking the chimpanzee when they weren't supposed to. In the end, NASA decided they wanted to study that more, and they delayed Shepard's flight. And then, bada bing, a couple weeks after Shepard was supposed to have flown, Yuri Gagarin flown. And of course, Al Shepard was very, very upset about this, as you could imagine. But anyway, this is man's first step, and so basically dipping your toe into the deep end of the pool, actually the shallow end of the pool. And from there, we continued to work hard, both the Soviets and the United States, to learn how to put humans in space and to keep the high ground, basically, to be first and most powerful. So after the 6 Vostok missions, we went to the Voskhod program. And Voskhod was designed by Sergei Korolov to be very much methodical, in the same way that the United States was methodical with Mercury, and then extremely methodical with Gemini. I mean, step by step by step in this order, learn this, then do that, then build on those 2 things and do something new. That's the way that Sergei Korolov and his engineers understood that they had to stay ahead and of these United States and forge a strong and durable space program. But Khrushchev wanted stunts, and Khrushchev derailed the plans for Voskhod 1 and said, I want you to send up multiple people in one spacecraft. And he said, I don't want it just to be 2, it has to be 3. And Sergei Korolov, he had to do it, he was told. And so there was no getting around it. They stripped down the Voskhod as much as they could, and they squeezed these 3 people into the spacecraft with no spacesuits. And they knew that this was absolutely beyond all safety margins that they had ever developed as protocols. The 3 people that flew were Vladimir Komarov, Konstantin Fiak, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, Fiaktizvit, and Boris Yegorov, I think is how you pronounce his last name. Now, I know how to spell or pronounce Vladimir Komarov's name because I've heard it many, many times, because he's very famous, as we'll see, not for a very good reason, unfortunately. But the other 2 gentlemen, one of them, I'm not sure which one it was, but I think it was the Boris Yegorov, was actually a medical doctor, because what I remember reading was that none of the other astronauts wanted to fly this flight. They thought it was too dangerous. And so the doctor, the medical doctor, volunteered for it. And so he flew, became a cosmonaut. So Voskhod 1 flew in October of 1964, and it was a success. That was the first crewed mission that ever existed. And so they got another first, the Soviets did. But as you can see, it was at a cost for the development of their program, and also at a cost for going beyond safety margins. Now, it turns out that between Voskhod 1 and Voskhod 2, that Khrushchev, the premier of Soviet Union, was then deposed And through that transition, we finally, a year later, had the Voskhod 2 mission. In the Voskhod 2 mission, we have what's called the first spacewalk, or EVA, for extravehicular activity. And so this mission, which was spectacular because of this first, was also one in which the spacewalking astronaut was very, very close to death. So these are the two gentlemen here in the lower right-hand corner, and I'd like to bring your attention to Alexi Lanov. Leonov is sort of the Armstrong of the Soviet program. You know, as Armstrong is to the United States, the most famous astronaut. Alexi Lanov is the most famous astronaut in the Soviet Union. Of course, Yuri Gagarin is also very famous in the same way that John Glenn is very famous and Alan Shepard are very famous. But Alexei Leonov was basically the astronaut that was selected to walk on the moon through the Soviet lunar program. And one thing that is not well known is that the Soviet lunar program would only have one cosmonaut fly down to the surface of the moon, and they would walk alone. So you would literally be alone on the moon if you were a Soviet cosmonaut in their program. So let's talk about Alexei Leonov's spacewalk. So here are some photographs of it. You remember from our Rocket Pioneers lecture, we also talked about Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and how he had designed all of these spacecraft ahead of time, developed the rocket equation, and even wrote down procedures for space missions, of which one of them was, how do you do a spacewalk? And Sergei Korolov clearly had read Tsiolkovsky's work, and they designed this mission to be basically following the procedure list that Tsiolkovsky had put together. And that is basically, you see here, that they pressurized an inflatable area, sort of a transfer airlock, and they blew it up with pressure from the inside of the cabin. And Alexei Leonov climbed in, closed the door, and then they depressurized it and opened the hatch, and out he came, and he floated around. And I think he was out there for something like 10 minutes. Now, one of the things that happened, which was horrible, was that his spacesuit started to expand on him from the pressure. And literally, his feet came out of the feet of the spacesuit, and the feet were dangling in the bottom, and his feet were where the ankles should be. And the same thing was happening to his hands. So he was losing all dexterity and control, not to mention that he was inflated. And I don't really know the technical reasons why his spacesuit started to bloat like that, but it actually happened. And so he knew he was in a lot of trouble, and he tried to get back into the airlock, but it turned out that the spacesuit had inflated so much that he could barely get into the airlock. He was supposed to go into the airlock feet first, and he couldn't do that. So he had to go in head first. And then, of course, he couldn't turn around to close the hatch on the outer part of it. So he had to turn around inside of it, and he barely survived doing it. And so he finally got it closed, and then they were able to depressurize it or pressurize it, and he was able to come back inside the spacecraft. But it was very much touch and go. He was very, very upset at the engineers for not having, thought through all these things, and the procedures hadn't been tested well enough. Now, there are a lot of good, on YouTube, there are a lot of good movies. Some of them are short and you can watch them of the spacewalk with Leonov. And I really suggest that you go to YouTube and type spacewalk Leonov or Vostok 2 spacewalk, and you actually get to watch him float around. And this picture here of Alexei is a picture that is actually taken from one of those movies. It's a clip from a movie clip, and it's been colorized because the true film, was just in black and white. So then they had trouble when they went through reentry as well. So they had these malfunctions, and they actually overshot their area and landed in Siberia in trees. They crashed through trees. and landed in Siberia, which was a snow-covered mountainside, completely remote. They spent 2 days struggling to survive out there in the space capsule. Word is it they actually had to fight off a pack of wolves who were very interested in them for dinner. Eventually they were picked up, and you can see this picture here of Alexi Lanov with the trees in the background when he was first discovered and rescued. So this mission was really kind of, a series of debacles. But on the other hand, in the history books, Alexei Leonov, the first man to walk in space, and of course, did it before the United States. So guess what? Another one on the checklist for the Soviet Union, they did this first, okay? This was in March of 1965. Now you might recall that after the shakedown mission of Gemini 3, I believe right after that is when Alexei Leonov did a spacewalk. And so they revamped the Gemini 4 mission so that Ed White would actually go out into space, and he did a 20-minute spacewalk, which was twice as long as Alexei Leonov. So now the US has the record for the spacewalk. And guess what, Soviets? We did it too. You're not that far ahead of us. So, a lot of this competition going on, driving these things forward. Here's some more pictures of Alexei Leonov. And these are more of the movie clip stills that were taken, and you get a real feeling for the fact that this human being was floating out in space. Pretty breathtaking, actually, when you think about it. I can't even imagine what it must be like. I'm sure that he experienced the overview effect. Okay, so let's talk about Sergei Korolov for a moment. And we've gone through the history of his life. From a young engineering student who was an aeronautical engineer that built airplanes that won awards, to going into the field of rocketry, forming GERD, the Rocketry Society, Amateur Rocketry Society, getting recruited by the Army, developing rockets, and then being singled out by Stalin and Glushko and sent to a concentration camp. And so, and then finally coming back from the concentration camp, working under house arrest for the Soviet rocket program again, then going to Germany, bringing back the German V2 technology, and then developing over time under a great deal of pressure and not really as truly as a free man for the first years, the R7 rocket. Of course, he was eventually released from the house arrest and became a free man, showing that he was definitely dedicated to the Soviet program and to the Soviets themselves, the Soviet country. But I'd just like to show these pictures because, we see them as old black and white photos of this person. And we think of this person only in terms of their adult life, their adult body that we see. And we only think of them in terms of the accomplishments that are written down in a history book. But remember that everybody is basically just like you. Just like you, they had a childhood, they grew up, they had dreams, they had, all of the insecurities that go with it. They had all of the faith that goes into working hard, that they can achieve the arc of their life goals. And he was one of these individuals. And so I just want to show you some pictures of him as a child or a young student. Here he is, a very young student getting his pilot's license. Here he is in college, having developed this airplane for which he received an award. I believe it was a glider that he actually flew. Here he is with his wife and child before they became estranged. So not only was he a young man growing up like the rest of you young individuals, but then, he was also a family person as well. Here he is in the military when he's in Germany looking for the German counterpart of exercising the German counterpart of the United States program called Project Paperclip, if you remember that, to basically garnering German rocket scientists and German rocket technology. Here he is with Laika, the dog that he sent into space in Sputnik 2. And you can see he's a very young person still there. I mean, he may look old to you, but at this point in time, he's already has behind him the fact that he's built the R-7 rocket, put Yuri Gagarin into space, and put, I'm sorry, not yet, but already put Sputnik into space. This was Sputnik 2 that he flew like a. Here he is talking to some of the cosmonauts. He was always known for always being on the radio and being supportive with them. And he was a very intelligent individual. He was not just an engineer, but also a planner. And he also worked with politicians, not in the way that James Webb worked with the United States politicians, but he worked with an individual, Nikita Khrushchev. And that was very difficult to do because everything was at the whim of Khrushchev. And he was always competing with rival factions too that were looking for money from Khrushchev. And so he was always battling money, battling funds, working with the fact that he didn't have a complex industrial complex like the United States had, that it was very difficult to get things manufactured on time, to get them tested, to have them have quality. He dealt with things that were much more difficult than any of the Americans had to deal with. And yet he pulled it all off. He was an astonishing driver of an individual. And here he is now with Yuri Gagarin. They're enjoying a quiet moment together after Yuri Gagarin's flight. Of course, Yuri Gagarin became a world name, extremely famous, and Sergei Korolov was unknown to the world. The Soviet Union kept his name secret, as I've talked about, and just called him the chief designer. So he was never known to anybody. And then here's his grave site that is being guarded shortly after his death for his funeral. And then here is a bust statue showing you that the Soviet Union has now come to recognize him, and he's very, very well known and loved in the Soviet Union. So I just wanted to share that picture of this person's life with you, because in the end, he drove everything to making the rocket, launching the Sputnik, getting the astronauts in space or cosmonauts in space. He really had this dream, and he really almost single-handedly drove this. And so one person can really make a difference. I guess, you know, everybody knows Elon Musk. And so in a sense, you could think of him as the Elon Musk of his time. Now, unfortunately, he died on the operating table from internal bleeding. He had a cancerous pulp in his intestines that was quite large, and he had a weak heart. And a lot of this was because his health had been failing because of all the tremendous pressure on him. And in the end, when he went for the operation, he didn't come out. And of course, this was a horrendous blow for the Soviet program, because they had really, in a sense, put all of their eggs in one basket with Korolov. And they didn't really design a system that was had collaborators and multiple high-level managers. You basically had a pyramidal structure with Korolov at the top. In the same way, at the government, you had a pyramid structure with Khrushchev at the top. So what happens then is, that these other missions that were planned, they all got scrubbed. And so here's a list of up to Voskhod 6. You know, Voskhod 3 was supposed to be 15 days. I'm sorry, it was supposed to be an 18-day space mission, but 15 days before its launch, it got canceled. Now, I cannot even imagine if you were the cosmonauts planning to fly that, and all of a sudden, you know, you're grounded and everything's off. It's got to be heartbreaking, especially after you've trained for 2 years. They were going to do some missile detection type of equipment testing, so you can see that it was somewhat militarized. By the way, the premier that replaced Khrushchev, if you recall from a previous lecture, was Brezhnev, who stayed in power quite a long time, all through the 70s. Okay, so it was never formally canceled, but you know, it lost impetus and it basically faded away. And one of the things that Brezhnev was known for was that he wasn't an aggressive individual like Khrushchev was. And I guess I should revert back to saying something about Khrushchev and his intensity. As you can see in this picture of Khrushchev here, which I believe is taken at the United Nations, he was known for saying things that, you know, we are going to crush the United States. And he's known for taking off his shoe and pounding it on the podium. He was just this hot-tempered, loose cannon. And he finally, like I said, was deposed and became, in the Soviet Union, what we call a non-entity. And so he gets written out of the history books for a while until, of course, you have perestroika and the thawing of the Soviet Union in the late 80s under Gorbachev. Okay, so anyway, he fell from power in 1964, like I said, between the Voskhod 1 and 2 flights, so just before the spacewalk. Now, not only did Voskhod 3 get canceled, but Voskhod 4, which was planned, was all going to be a 20-day flight. Okay, it was canceled in the spring of '66. And part of what made them lose confidence was these near disasters that happened on Voskhod 2. So I've told you that not only was the spacewalk almost a fatal disaster, but the re-entry was almost a fatal disaster, not to mention being lost in Siberia for 2 days. Voskhod 5 was going to be a crewed mission with all females. It was going to be 10 days long, and there would have been the first female spacewalk. So this was meant to be another, Soviet double first, all women crew and first women spacewalk. So they really were all about basically checking these boxes for the firsts. This also was canceled in the spring of '66 after Korolov's death. And at that point, the Soviet Union was taken over by a gentleman by the name of Mishkin, and he was informed that he should work on a new project called Soyuz and also start developing the lunar landing programs to concentrate on those, even though those had been started as early as '64. Voskhod 6 was also planned, also was supposed to have an extravehicular activity and a test of a jet belt. So again, the Buck Rogers thing. If you remember right, it was on Gemini 9 that Gene Cernan was supposed to test a Navy backpack, jet backpack, and fly free. And it turned out the Soviet Unions were trying to do this as well, but nobody accomplished it. And if you know your space history, you'll know that it wasn't until Bruce McCandless flew in the late 1980s and put on a jetpack and flew free from the space shuttle. So that really it had to wait until the late 1980s, 20 years after these first attempts, or at least planned attempts. Now, we talked about fallen astronauts for the United States. And by the way, I want to say that brings me to my spacecraft phrase. And I would say that the space capsule, I always forget these words, the space capsule payload is Khrushchev's fist. Okay, I got it out. Back to the astronauts. So the astronauts, we talked about the astronauts who had passed away in the Gemini program, or they were Gemini astronauts. And so these 3 astronauts had passed away, 2 by flying into the factory where their spacecraft was being built. I think that's Charlie Bassett and Elliot C. And then there was Clifford Williams, who was taking off and flew into a flock of geese and died from that. Later on, we'll find out that in January of '67, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee will die in a fire in the Apollo 1 spacecraft. Soon after, the United States suffered that fire in the Apollo 1 spacecraft, and those 3 additional American astronauts died, for a total of 6 now. We have our first cosmonaut death, and this is the death of Vladimir Komarov, and this was on the first Soyuz mission. So imagine, you've got this Voskhod 2 mission, almost disastrous, all the other ones get canceled, and then you put up your first shakedown flight, as they call it, when you're doing a space capsule's test run for the first time, and it kills the astronaut. And so this was the death of Vladimir Komarov. And this unfortunate gentleman bashed into the ground at over 400 miles per hour. And he was fully aware as he was coming down through the atmosphere that nothing was going to stop his fall or break his fall, and that he was going to be dead when he hit. Now, one of the problems that happened was, again, the separation of that service module got tangled up. And then when the chutes came out from his Voskhod, or sorry, his Soyuz 1 spacecraft, the chutes came out, they got tangled up in some of that debris that was out there. And he never survived that. So I guess I should tell the story backwards a little bit first. When the service module separated from the spacecraft, that caused the thing to start spinning out of control. And they thought that he would never be able to fire his retro rockets, and he was spinning out of control. And they thought he's a dead cosmonaut. And so much that they brought his wife in, and she spoke with him on the radio, and so that they could say goodbye to each other. But Komarov was not ready to die, and he somehow wrestled this craft to the point where he fired the retro rockets sufficiently so that he could re-enter the atmosphere. That's when he let the chutes out, that the chutes got caught and the chutes got all tangled up. And so that was all she wrote. And down he came and hit the ground at 400 miles per hour. So when we say that the astronauts were brave, they were brave because you could die from any small technical glitch that happened. And this is one of the things that I would like you to appreciate. Every individual who tightened a screw or built a wire connection or any piece that went into one of these spacecrafts, they knew that if they didn't do their job at 100%, that they could be the person that would be responsible for why a person would die. And so there was this amazing dedication to quality that happened, and this invested emotion that was put in by these people that built these parts for the spacecraft. The unfortunate thing about the Soviet Union was they just didn't have the ability and the funding to do all of the testing along the way to demonstrate that everything was robust before they actually integrated it and flew missions. And of course, this cost some lives. Another disaster that happened was on Soyuz 11. This is somewhat later, about 4 years later, in June of 1971. And by June of 1971, we had gone to the moon several times. But I also like to know that there's another disaster parallel the United States, and that is that it was in April of 1971 that Apollo 13 went to the moon. And I think everybody has heard of the story of Apollo 13, where one of their oxygen tanks exploded while they were about 2/3 on the way out to the moon. And they never did go into orbit or walk on the moon. They had to come straight home, and they barely survived that. Well, it was only again, 2 months later that the Soviet Union lost 3 cosmonauts. And this is a really sad story because they actually had this very long mission. They completed all of the objectives of the mission. In fact, I think they had been on the Soyuz, the Mir space station, or Salute. It was a Salute space station, I believe, back in those days. You can tell I don't know every detail about the Soviet space program. And so the deal was that they had been on the space station, their spacecraft had been docked, they did their mission. I think they were up there something like 2 weeks, or I don't know how long it was, but a good duration of time. It may have been much longer. And they got in the spacecraft, they were all ready to come home. And again, during re-entry, there was a jolt from when the service module was being released, and it had jolted this valve that opened the space capsule to the atmosphere, and the air leaked out, and they basically died on the way down from this leaked lack of pressure in the cabin. They said that actually they were sitting in the couch peacefully when they landed. They opened the hatch, looked in, they were sitting there peacefully, but they had blood running out of their nose from the lack of pressure that had caused some of the internal and external bleeding. So these 3 gentlemen were found dead on their couches. And their first signs of it was that when they came down, came through the blackout, remember the loss of signal when you come through the atmosphere, was that they couldn't contact them. They could tell that the radio signal was being received, but there was no response from the astronauts. So that's another sad thing. Now these individuals were all included on the fallen astronaut plaque that Dave Scott on Apollo 15 put on the moon that I showed in my previous lecture. So this is our last slide. And this is a timeline that I put together, which I really hope you'll spend some time looking at. It's on the notes, so you can print out the PDFs. Over on the left-hand side here is sort of your all-in-one overview. Blue is American and red is Russian, and this goes from 1960 to 1972. Now, you remember that Mercury, there's Alan Shepard, there's Gus Grissom, all the way through to Gordon Cooper. And then we have the Gemini missions here being flown. These are the two test missions that were unmanned, and then you have Grissom and Young, followed by the rest of the missions. And then finally a Gemini 12 with Lovell and Aldrin. Now during this time, you can see there was a lot of activity with Vostok, the 6 missions that I described here in this particular lecture, and then the 2 Voskhod missions. Moving to Soyuz 1, here's Komarov and his death, and then out here toward 11 is the death. See, Apollo 13 was probably right here. So this is probably the death of those 3 astronauts in Soyuz 11. And then you also had some space stations that were launched by the Soviets that, at this time. As you can see, at Edwards Air Force Base, people were flying the X-15 into space. So this was basically a rocket plane that lifted off and then landed on the runway. And then, of course, the Apollo missions that started in 1967. And the first Apollo mission to go to the moon was in December of 1968. Okay, and then that last one was in December of 1972, Apollo 17. So on this timeline, which goes from 56 up to 71, I basically cut it there, even though Apollo was still going. But I just am trying to concentrate on the early part of the space race. These are the main events that happened. Red again, Russian, blue, American, and then historical context in black, which basically I put Kennedy's moon speech here and the Apollo on fire. So we come along here in October of 57 with Sputnik, and this is the beginning of the space race. Then right away, a month later, Sputnik 2 with Laika in orbit. The United States finally got into space with Explorer 1. These are from our previous lectures, okay? In this time, Korolov sent Luna 3 and took photos of the far side of the moon and whatnot. And then Sputnik 5, 2 dogs in orbit, actually recovered alive for the first time, okay? And this really means that they're ready to send a human into space. And so here we are at April 12th of 1961, and Yuri Gagarin does a single flight. And as we discussed, that it should have been Alan Shepard, but he got moved back to May 5th or 6th. And here's Shepard's suborbital flight. Now, right after that, so that we had definitely answered the Soviets with somebody in space, that's when Kennedy gave his moon speech. Within 3 weeks, I mean, that's it. We had lobbed Shepard up and down. We had 15 minutes of experience. And he said, you know what? We're going to go to the moon. And this was throwing the ball way down the field. This was not just sort of kicking it, 10 yards down the field. After that, we have Gussum's suborbital. And then, as I described shortly afterwards, was Titov 17 orbits. So they're way ahead of us. We've only done two suborbital flights. Glenn answers with 3 orbits. Again, you probably remember he had that airbag scare, and he was supposed to do 7 orbits. Followed by Scott Carpenter and his somewhat botched mission, where he came 300 miles off course when he landed, barely made it home alive. He did 4 orbits. Then Voskhod 3 and 4, the 2 manned spacecraft that flew within about 5 miles of each other, that made us think that maybe they had learned how to do rendezvous. But guess what? We answered that with Schirra and his 6 orbits. So we were not ready yet to do any rendezvous. And then we answered that with Cooper's 24 orbits. So we pushed ourselves up to 24 orbits, even though by this time the Soviets had done something like, I think, up to 50 something orbits. Okay, so then we have, back to back, finally we get the two-man spacecraft and we get the first woman in space. Okay, and then we have Voskhod 1. This is the first crew ever that happened here. So you can see that we've only put one person up in a spacecraft per time at this stage. And then you have Voskhod 2 here, which was the spacewalk. Now, the Gemini shakedown flight with Grissom and Young happened just before that. This was the corned beef sandwich debacle. And then we answered right away with Gemini 4 for the EVA spacewalk, and then followed that by Gemini 5 or 5-day duration flight, followed then by a true rendezvous in space, the real first one here. First of all, the 14 duration flight, which was the longest flight that set a record, and then the rendezvous where 6 rendezvoused with 7. So this really was a huge history-making moment, Gemini 6 and Gemini 7, where we didn't pull the stunts like the Soviets did in that case. We actually sent up 2 crewed missions and they actually rendezvoused. And we had long duration flights, so a lot of records there. Gemini 8, we have the first docking. Okay, this happens. But by now you're going to notice that the Soviets aren't really answering with crewed space missions, manned space missions, after this Voskhod 2 situation. And so then we have Luna 9, the first landing on the moon by the Soviets. So they got another first there. And then of course we have Gemini 10, I'm sorry, Gemini 9, Gemini 10, Gemini 11, and then Gemini 12. And so Gemini then wraps up this project, and we've done many, many hours of EVA, up to 5 hours of EVA. We've done multiple dockings. We've fired the rocket on the target vehicle to change our orbits. We've really learned how to fly in space. The Soviets, not so much, okay? They still don't know how to even change their orbit from one to another in Earth orbit. And then we hit the Apollo program in 1967. And you can see the distance between Gemini 12 and the first Apollo program was very short. And the United States was really aggressively pushing forward. And so the training for Apollo 1 was happening even before Gemini stopped. And then we have this tragic accident called the Apollo 1 fire, where Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee burned up while the space capsule was still on the launch pad during a routine test pressurizing the capsule. That really delayed the next flight. Finally, we have Apollo 7. So there was a lot of test flights between 1 and 7. Apollo 7 was the shakedown in low Earth orbit. We call that LEO. And so this was several orbits of the refurbished Apollo spacecraft called the Block 2 spacecraft. And then they wanted to put humans on the Saturn V, the big beast rocket, and they wanted to send them to the moon next. And it's an amazing story I won't go into now, but Apollo 8 was not originally planned to go to the moon, but the CIA had told NASA that the Soviets looked like they were planning a manned moonshot, okay? And so this is one of the things that we'll talk about when we come back to the second part of the Soviet Union story. Well, then we have Apollo 9, where we test the entire lunar landing module and the command module around Earth orbit to practice docking them and all of that. And then the Apollo 10, which is called the dress rehearsal for the moon landing. Basically, Apollo 10 did everything that Apollo 11 needed to do to land on the moon except execute the landing itself. And then Apollo 11 executed the landing and landed on Tranquility Base. Then we have Apollo 12, which I told you is a hoot of a mission that you should definitely watch, From the Earth to the Moon. And I think it's the second episode, which has the Apollo 12 mission. And it does not exaggerate the fun-loving behavior of these juvenile astronauts, if you will, from the Navy. And then we have Apollo 13, and that was aborted. And then, of course, shortly after that, we have the Vostok, or sorry, the Soyuz 11 disaster, which I didn't put on here. And believe it or not, the Soviets landed the Venera 7 on Venus. So they were moving into a different territory of space as they were losing the moon race. And they were the first on Venus, and they were the first around the moon, actually. So anyhow, this is the timeline, and I hope you enjoyed seeing that a little bit. So that's our story of what the Soviets were doing during the period of Mercury and Gemini, and then we'll be moving into Apollo the next time we come back. So until next time, I guess we'll be seeing each other on the moon.